Okay. Uh, so let's dive right into CSS then. CSS is uh, how our web sites get styled, and it is basically a file that we include in our HTML somewhere in uh, a link tag. We uh, specify what CSS files to pull in. So there could be multiple files. Let's try and see if there's an example that we could go to. So let's try Instagram and then open up our developer tools. To our elements. So if you see here at the top, there's some link tags and they link to these bundles.css files. And this is where the files are essentially pulling in CSS styles from different CSS files to apply to the elements on this page. Essentially, they compute to these styles that you see on the right-hand side here. There's multiple. You could have them pulled in from multiple sources. You can have every CSS file that you use like combined into one. There's multiple different approaches of bundling. But yeah, that's sort of how we associate the HTML with the CSS. So CSS rules. So basically we have two parts of each CSS statement that we have in our CSS file. And basically the first part is specifying what element we want to pick to apply the styles to. That's called the selector, where we denote the specific element or elements that we want the style to apply to, and then within that selector we make some statements about how we want to style them. So this is the li is saying basically pick all the list item elements, and then apply this color to the text within those elements. And so this will pick all the li elements of the entire page. So it's a very broad statement. Yeah. Oh yeah, this kind of did it. The animation actually showed it being styled, because these kind of bullet points state that they're list elements and list items, and then it actually styled them blue, so that was pretty cool. So we're gonna learn how to write syntax for CSS, and we're also gonna learn different ways to choose which elements to change, so how to select the elements. There's different ways we can go about doing that. And some different style properties that we can change. Obviously, we're not gonna go over every single one because there's really a lot of them, but it's more the high level concepts that we're gonna go over, and to get you guys started in the basics. And then obviously you can get as involved and as intricate as you'd like. But there's some like high level concepts that we'll go over today that I think are sort of like best practices too when it comes to CSS. But initially it just helps to just get started, and it's fine to do it, maybe not optimally the first time, but just get it working. And then later on down the line, and through experience, you just kind of learn what are some pitfalls and what are some clean ways to write CSS. So yeah, CSS is the styling, HTML is the content. And then when you combine those two together, as I showed in the previous HTML file, within those link tags, it pulled in the CSS. So that's how they merge together. That's how the HTML knows like where to go to actually pull these styling rules. And so it's pretty important, as you can see here. Without CSS, it's just I mean, it still gets the main, text across. You don't really need CSS, but it's not as, it's a little easier on the eyes with the CSS, and it's definitely some way. It's a way that you can, set your website apart from others, is to style it in specific ways. So yeah. So there are some terms that we'll get familiar with. So the entire block of the styles and the selectors is called a rule. The top portion is the selector, which is essentially figuring out which elements to apply this style to. And then these actual styles are called declarations. And then they're comprised of properties, which is what you want to change, and then values, which is how you want to change it. So yeah, it's basically saying apply these styles that you put within the squiggly brackets to these elements that you put into the selector. So yeah, it'll still apply even though they don't exist on the page yet. If you create them, then the style will just start applying to them. So it doesn't have to exist beforehand. Like, you can make new HTML elements. If they fit this rule that you specified in the selector, then it'll just work. So yeah, it's very declarative. It's not programmatic in a way. It's more just like a set of rules, and there's no like conditional logic, or there's no functions or anything like that to run. It's just a set of rules. You go top down and you find each element and you apply the styles that are in between the squiggly brackets. So how are some ways? These are just some ways that we can figure out. We could essentially mark the HTML elements with tags so that the CSS can grab them. And this is not only so that CSS can grab them, but also the JavaScript can also grab HTML elements by these properties that we place on them. So here are some types of selectors. So a tag is basically like a P element, or a H1 element, or a div element, or in this case, a link element. It's the actual element, and it's pretty broad. So like, if you apply a style to a tag, then it'll apply to every single tag from that page. I tend to. There are certain cases where using this is useful, but I feel like a majority of the time it's a little too broad. So, once you apply a style to a tag, now every time you create a new tag, it's gonna automatically pull in that style. And there are times when that's useful, but for the most part, I think it's pretty good to use that sparingly, just because it's too broad and it's gonna have a lot of side effects. So I think it's, I won't say it's better, but it sometimes causes confusing behavior if you just start applying things to tags. Classes are the classic way that essentially styles are used, or classes are a standard like selector, just because they can be repeated. So IDs are similar to classes, but there's only supposed to be like one #academy ID in the entire HTML page. You're not supposed to put multiple IDs that are the same. So that's kind of limiting, because let's say you do want to group a set of HTML elements and then have a style apply to all of them. Then a tag might be a little too specific, too broad. ID is a little too specific, and then class is kind of like that just right middle area where you can apply it to specific elements that you give to that tag to, that class name to, but also it won't apply to everything, because you have to give it that selector, give that HTML element that selector. You could also select by attribute. This one's not as common, but you can use an attribute. So type equals file, or I guess in this case it'd be like href equals, because href is an attribute. So you can select by that. And there's also like pseudo elements. So when you do colon, these are a little more advanced, but when you start using like colon after, that basically refers to an element that kind of doesn't exist, but it still takes up space on the page. So you can style that. I honestly know that it's very useful for certain things, but personally I don't use it too much. And hover is a state. So essentially, if you pick, if you put a tag, like if you put class name full stack, and then you do colon hover, then it'll apply when you hover over that element. And so we'll go over examples of this so it makes more sense. But I would say class is like the most heavily used and classic selector, because it can apply to groups, it can apply to a single element, it can do kind of a lot. So yeah, you can combine selectors. So here we do like tag dot class, which means you're getting more specific, and the reason why you might do this is because CSS is cascading, and so there might be one rule that applies, and so when you just try to use a single selector, it doesn't apply because something else that has a higher specificity is applying that rule. So you might need to get more specific and start adding a bunch of rules so that your specificity overrules the existing specificity. But once you start doing that, usually it means like maybe there's a different way to structure your styles, because then it can be a cycle where you're just like trying to put all these crazy selectors together because you don't know what style is overriding what. And so there's definitely some complexity there, but for now we'll just go over sort of how it works. When you put a space, so when the tag and the class are together, basically you're saying like the element has to have both of those properties. When you have a tag space class, that means that the second thing that came after the first is a child, and then the tag is the parent. So it's saying like, oh, like get the element that has this class name and has a parent with this tag. And then if you do a comma, that means or. Again, like when you start putting, I don't really see this too often, like commas, just because it's a little confusing. Like when you start saying like, or it could do this or this, then you don't really know which one is causing that rule to happen. So when you start getting too crazy with these, usually means like it's getting out of hand. But yeah, when you put a greater than sign, it means the direct parent. So the white space just meant any parent, like any ancestor, and then the greater than sign means it has to be a direct parent of that element. So let's go over like some quick examples. I know this is all just words, so we should try and apply this here. So here we have this page, and if we wanted to apply a style to this, I would say, we could do this header, and then like color is blue. That's one way. We could have also done like H1, color is blue, still work. What's a widely accepted way is to put classes, because usually the purpose of IDs aren't it's to uniquely identify this element as this ID, but classes are a little more used for styles, and that's because there can be duplicate classes. So like this is header. We could call this, and then we'll say header class or something. And usually, when you put the class attribute on this HTML element, you're kind of denoting that this is used for CSS to pull it in. ID, if you put an ID, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to denote a property for CSS to pull. It could be a variety of other things. So I would say going with the class approach is like the safest approach. And so here we could say dot header, or we could just say yeah. And the thing about classes is like you could put it on here too if you wanted, and then that would change everything here to blue. So yeah, you wouldn't want to do something like have two IDs that are the same. I don't think it's gonna break, but technically that's not like the use case for IDs. IDs are supposed to be unique on a HTML page. What else is there? Yeah, so in terms of specificity, so if I had, let's try to think of an example here. If I had like H1 is red, basically, there's like, we'll probably go over specificity a little bit later, but basically, when these two selectors clash, there's like a set of rules that tells CSS, take this style, apply this style, and don't apply this one, even though they're the same. So they're applying to the same element, but as you can see here, classes are more specific than elements. So it'll take this rule over this rule. But we'll get into that more later. So yeah, what this means is basically it has to match both tag and class. So here if I say H1, right, then it won't apply anymore because it's saying like this has to be an H1 element with the header class, and so only this one applies. Even though this one has this header class, it's not an H1 element, so it won't apply this style. Let's try the ancestor one. So this one's saying, you could say, you put it on the P, then when you do header class, it should, it'll turn this element blue. But if you say, let's see. If you say it has to be a child of a list element, right, it won't apply anymore because none of these have an ancestor that's a list element. This one and this one, their ancestors are divs, so it won't apply anymore. But if you did div, then it'll work because the parents are divs. So they're just like different layers of rules, and you could combine them and mix and match them in different ways in order to get your style to apply. But I would say, getting really complicated and making really long rules is a surefire way for you to get a headache. So it's best to just keep them as simple as possible. If you can only use class names, that would be ideal. Obviously, there's certain cases where you might have these workarounds and you might have to override certain styles, but in a best case scenario, like we just keep things really simple, like have just a class name. Don't put like parent of this with like these two classes have to, be the same, and it gets kind of a little much. So initially, the best effort you should try and keep everything limited to just class names. You could put CSS comments here with this syntax, and this can be helpful for certain styles. So, sometimes you want to explain why you chose a certain number of pixels. So like if I said, like height is, or let's say, let me try height. This work? Yeah, so let's say I pick like a random number, then maybe it helps to explain why you chose that number, because sometimes if you see a CSS page with a bunch of random values, then it's not really helpful. So you might want to add some context to why you chose certain sizes. So yeah, the name cascading comes from the fact that each element style is basically a bunch of different rules, and they all come together, and then CSS sort of picks which one is the most specific, and it'll apply that one. So yeah, if we can see here, there's two CSS sheets that this HTML file links to. So this one's the first one, this one's the second one. So it looks like each list element should be red and with a font size 40. So those get applied. But also, you can also do inline styles, which basically is a HTML attribute where you just pass in a string with the similar syntax to CSS, and that's another way to style something. You don't even need a CSS page. You can just have a bunch of styles like this. The reason why it's better to separate them out is just so that, first of all, your HTML is a lot cleaner. Like, you know what it does. Like, it's there for the scaffolding of the web page and nothing else. So it's cleaner to look at. There's not a lot of crazy styles affecting your HTML page and making it harder to read and reason about. So it's like neater, first of all, to put everything in its own style sheet. And yeah, also, you don't have to change your HTML file in order to change styles. You can, everything is, when you want to change the styles, you go to the CSS. When you want to change the scaffolding, you go to the HTML. And so you kind of know where to go to do certain things, and you don't, have to go into HTML for both. What else is there? And yeah, there's certain things that you can do. I think there's like a small subset of styles that you can't, it's harder to do inline than by using a CSS file. But again, there's multiple ways to go about it. So yeah, so like here you could just pass a style property and start saying, let's get rid of this. Color is yeah, so it'll override this one because inline styles are really specific or highly prioritized over CSS. So it'll actually be red instead of blue because it takes this as a higher prio style. So this is a cause of a lot of headache in CSS is when declarations conflict. So when you have, two things, and we kind of went over this before, where essentially you have let's say this block is a div and you put background red, and then you also have an ID, background blue, so they're in conflict. It'll usually pick the higher specific one, the more specific one, and there's a bunch of rules here that we can see. Specificity of CSS rule selectors, you can find them on any website, but basically it's there to say that ID, so when you put it in a style attribute, that's one of the strongest. That's why here this style overrides this style, because this one is inline, so it has a really strong specificity. When you combine selectors, you get the specificity of the selectors combined. So yeah, it's like usually when you start adding a bunch of rules, like, oh, it's the parent of this, it's the class that has, the parent is this tag, the class has this name, it also has this ID. When you start adding all those together, then it becomes more and more specific. ID is higher specificity than class. So if you had an ID header, and you put header is red, that's weird. Let me write syntax for this. ID is higher specificity than the class selector. Oh, I need to put color. Yeah, so even though they're the same, they're touching the same element and telling them different things. They're telling the element to be have a different identity, but this one overrides this because it's using the ID and it's higher specificity. So there's a bunch of rules. Attribute is higher than element, and there's a bunch of lower prio selectors. But it helps to know, and if you guys are ever confused, you guys can just look online and it'll tell you like this list from more specific to less specific. So here it'll take this because a tag selector has less of a priority than the ID. And here it'll take the class because class is more specific than a tag. Here it'll take, like, even though you're combining this is saying like, oh, like it has to have the class. So when you put a space, that means when you put a white space between classes, that means it's an entirely new class. So you're combining two different classes. So yeah, in this case, it would be more specific than one class, but it's still less specific than ID. So there's just a bunch of rules like this. Honestly, like I forget them all the time. But it's good if you should know them if in case you need to override something, but the mere fact that you're needing to override something means like something might be wrong, and like you might have like overdone the complexity of the styling. So it's good to never need to know these things, I guess, just because you just keep it a class and then you just affect those classes. You don't need to try and get super complicated. And then the inline style is the most specific. So it'll be, this selector, because it'll take this one, even though there's these two conflicting, it'll take this one just because that one's written directly in line. So yeah, CSS, this is supposed to be, I think this is supposed to be an animation of Peter like trying to undo these. Maybe it's not going, but if you guys, yeah, it's like, it's something that you headbang. Every developer has to go through this like rite of passage of like being annoyed by CSS or not wondering why your rule is not applying because some other CSS file has some really specific thing and you can't override that. So yeah, it's really challenging, and there's many different approaches to try and solve for this. So in a lot of cases, like um, a lot of approaches can involve like you basically, well, nowadays when you create web applications, you would have like multiple um, it's like you have one HTML file, but you have a bunch of JavaScript files that affect a small portion of that HTML, and then you have a CSS file that like only affects that small real estate of HTML. So you don't have all these crazy conflicting things that these global styles apply to. And so there's many different ways to mitigate this like headache that we'll learn like in the JavaScript portion. And when you start making web apps that are like really complicated and like large, like you'll start using these tactics to not have to use one CSS file that applies to the entire page and all the elements, because there's bound to be conflicts there. You just try to like break it out into small components and have that CSS only affect this small area, so that even if you have to debug, like you're only looking at a small portion, like you're looking at the footer or you're looking at the nav bar. You're not looking at like the entire page and all the different, you know, links and all of those pages. You know, it can lead to a very confusing approach. So it's kind of like nowadays we break up these files into small portions that only represent a subset of the HTML, and then you kind of apply your styles there, and it'll only affect that environment. But for now, it's fine to just think simply in terms of like just one page, and then if it's just one page with like a couple sections, then ideally we should be fine just having like class names and styles that apply to those class names. So there are some like good ideals to like, I think it's called BEM, where in terms of like how you name your class names. So, you know, you have like a button class, and then, you know, you name things like button state success, button state danger. Like it's like very descriptive, like the names. And because you have this button class, it's like very reusable. You could put that on any button and it'll take in all these styles, and you're encapsulating all these styles that should apply to the button. And so there are these like naming organizational best practices that people could use for larger applications. So yeah, it's pretty much CSS in a nutshell. There's a lot of CSS specialists. I'm definitely not one of them. I try to use as little CSS as possible, and there are like style gurus and such that you can make really cool sites. Obviously, you guys might have seen some of these sites like where, you know, you have a lot of cool animations and you have a lot of cool transitions, and that's all made possible by CSS. CSS is a very powerful tool. But for me, I just kind of deal with the basics and the fundamentals, and I don't stray too much from that. But that is pretty much CSS. It's not a long lecture. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. But you guys can work through the exercises, and you guys will see sort of how to apply these styles. It's pretty straightforward in terms of like how it works. There might be some gotchas, and like for example, you know, if something was over, so if you had, let's say, like one tool, I guess, that you can use is like if this had two classes like header and success or something. And let's get rid of this. So it's blue. If you wanted to override that, I mean, yeah, you could do something like, header class and success, and then color green. And this should override this if you wanted to override it. Or you could, like the more rules you add, the more specific it's gonna get, and then the more priority it's gonna take. So you could even do like, oh, it's a child of div, right? If you don't want to do two classes, then this will also override this one because you're putting more rules, and the more rules you put, the more priority your style is gonna get. So yeah, that's all I got today for you guys. If there's no other questions, we can just go ahead and get started with the workshop, and then I can answer any questions that you guys have about this. Yeah.